All right, so we have one more speaker, and then after our final speaker, we are going to have some closing comments by Dr. Dick Norris, who is the faculty co-chair of our program. So Allison Watts is our final speaker of the day. Allison is a dive instructor and underwater photographer with over 10 years of experience working abroad in the recreational dive training industry. She has worked on several marine conservation expeditions and has recently returned from her Capstone travel in the Fiji Islands. So Allison had a completely different capstone project in mind when she headed to Fiji. She was going to, Allison loves taking underwater photographs. She brought her equipment to Catalina, and she has some really impressive photographs under her belt. So she wanted to make an underwater film. That was why she was going to Fiji. And she got there, and almost immediately, I think, there was a hurricane, which prevented her from making an underwater film. Roads were flooded. Her sort of supporting role photographer was not able to fly in. So Allison pivoted and came up with another plan. And I'll let her talk about what that is. But I think the fact that she was able to come up with a plan B and execute on it really is a testament to her resilience as a student and as a lead director of this project. So I'm really, really excited to welcome Allison Watts to come and give our closing presentation. So please join me in welcoming Allison Watts.
Thank you, Samantha, for that nice introduction. So the title of my presentation is A Qualitative Assessment of Fiji Dive Industry Perceptions of Coral Ecosystem Conditions. Nisei Bulavanaka. When I was 23, these were the footprints that I left behind in the sand along the shorelines in Fiji. I was a young, working dive professional, and this was my first job instructing while managing the dive operations at the Mango Bay Resort, a small, eco-friendly resort tucked along the Coral Coast on the remote island of Viti Levu. The South Pacific would soon feel like a second home to me. The thatched bury where I lived, overlooking the sea, the people next door in the village of Namatakula who shared their stories, their values, and told me about their lifestyle and subsistence that was so closely connected to the sea. It had been almost 9 years since I first left those footprints behind in the sand on Fiji's shoreline. I wondered if coral reefs were still the same, or if the tides were now changing. I was curious if coral reefs in Fiji were still as healthy, still as vibrant, from previous pictures and memories from before. I was concerned about implications of climate change, if corals were bleaching, adapting, or if coral reefs had been badly damaged during Hurricane Winston, a powerful Category 5 hurricane that made a direct landfall on the Fiji Islands back in early February of 2016. Winston was one of the strongest storms ever on record to directly hit the Fiji Islands, and it occurred during one of the strongest El Nino years in the Southern Hemisphere. I wanted to hear the stories and the perceptions of the dive operators and dive professionals working in Fiji about the health and conditions of coral reefs, communicated through the lens of what they were observing with their eyes. So here is a map of the Fiji Islands, which was the location of the project, and the targeted audience was the 60 recreational dive scuba operations, including dive shops, resorts, and liveaboards that operate throughout the Fiji Islands. The motivation of this project was just to find out what is the recreational dive community's overall perception of the current health of coral reef ecosystems. I want to briefly point out that a perception is not a fact, nor is it hard scientific evidence, but it can help us to learn more about the world that we live in from the observations of others, which is valuable. I would like to acknowledge my Capstone committee members, Dr. Stuart Sand in the chair, and also the part of the team was Alfredo Heron and Lindsay Benito. These were the specific research questions that I wanted to address as part of my Capstone project. 1, what is the recreational dive community's overall perception of current health of coral reef ecosystems in Fiji? 2, How can marine protection in Fiji be improved to better manage resources from the perspective of the dive community? And 3, is there anyone in the recreational dive community using citizen science to collect data through diver observations? Currently, there are plenty of observations of coral reefs in Fiji, but there is an absence of a single complete data set that includes all of coral reef ecosystems. Since there are no robust data sets available, I decided I wanted to ask the recreational dive community for their own assessment of the current status of coral reef health, along with any changes that they may have observed. These were the methods that I used. A survey was distributed to all the 60 dive operations that are listed as a business online. The survey consisted of 27 questions in total, 24 multiple choice, and 3 brief response questions. The survey was designed to be answered by dive operation managers and resort owners, and the survey included questions about income, nationality of the dive operation employees, along with questions that were specific to coral reef ecosystems. I informally interviewed 25 dive professionals, and this sample included both Fijian and non-Fijian dive masters and instructors. These interviews lasted anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour in duration, and each interviewee was asked the same 15 questions throughout the interviews, and then their responses were recorded. In the next several slides, we will go through some basic demographic information. I did create some little icons that will help guide you throughout the presentation. As you can see, the clipboard that's here on the method slide refers to the survey of dive operators, and the 2 people chatting here represents the informal interviews. So this is just some basic demographic information about the population that I surveyed. Most of the surveys that were sent out to the dive operations and resorts, most of those people were all Western people, so a lot of those dive operators were not Fijian. As you can see from the above graphs, 83% of the dive masters that I surveyed are Fijian. So most dive masters are Fijian, and there's about 9% of them that are non-Fijian. And in Fiji, there are more non-Fijian dive instructors that come from outside areas to work in Fiji, and there's only about 26% of the scuba instructors that are of Fijian nationality. So you may ask, why is nationality important? Why? Well, I think it's really an important variable to consider because people from the Fijian culture tend to be in the ocean more. They're more dependent on marine resources, and sometimes they spend their majority of life in the ocean. So they've been in the water at an earlier age, spearfishing, collecting, and they may have a different perception of health of the ocean. I asked 25 dive professionals during the informal interviews if they felt that coral reefs in their area that they were diving in were healthy, and this was their responses. 68% of the dive professionals in the informal interviews perceived that coral reefs are healthy, but 32% said that they did not perceive that coral reefs are healthy. This is basically just a word cloud. Now, this is basically just a word cloud, and it's kind of just like a visual representation of what some of the people that responded in the informal interviews had to say about coral reef health, some of the common mentioned themes that they attributed to coral reef health. Their responses included these type of themes. Coral reefs are healthy because coral reefs are healthy because there's lots of currents, nutrients, and upwelling. Coral reefs are healthy because there's minimal bleaching, lots of coral diversity, beautiful soft corals, and lots of fish species. They also talked about damage from cyclones, but it's important to mention they also observed recovery. New juvenile coral growth and a general perception of resilience was mentioned frequently among the interviewees after describing previous storm events. 35 recreational dive operations responded to the survey. When asked the question how they perceive coral reef health, this was their response. 80% of the dive operators that participated in the survey perceive that coral reefs are healthy. 17% perceive that coral reefs are not in a healthy condition, and 3% of the dive operators are not really sure if the coral reefs in their area are healthy. One of the survey questions asked for a brief response about why coral reefs in their area are healthy. having problems clicking slides today. Okay, but one of the survey questions asked for a brief response about why coral reefs are healthy, and this was some of the things that came up in the informal interviews. They mentioned some of the observations of why they thought their coral reefs were healthy. They said they were observing things such as minimal bleaching, marine biodiversity, and it was very similar to the same types of responses that were in the informal interviews. Coral reefs are healthy because they're resilient. We're seeing a lot of coral reefs recovering, and they talked about a lot of resilience after storm events. Even though 68% of dive professionals were informal, sorry, I'm missing a slide. Okay, 68% of dive professionals that were informally interviewed perceived that reefs tend to be healthy. They also discussed changes that they have observed. Some of the main observations, including cyclone damage from Winston, cyclone impacts, reefs recovering after disturbances, COTS outbreaks, coral bleaching, but not in the context of current bleaching events. Also, multiple interviewees mentioned decreases in fish populations and the sizes of larger fish such as Napoleon wrasse, humphead wrasse, groupers, trevellis, and declines in coral trout due to increasing fishing pressure. Okay, now we're at the slide that I want to be at. This is just a side-by-side comparison of the dive operators, and the people in the informal interviews. And as you can see, they both perceive that the general perception is, from what they're seeing, is they feel that coral reefs in Fiji are healthy. Okay, I wanted to know what type of protected area that the dive operators were taking customers diving in, so I asked them about it in the survey. 16 people in the survey responded that they do not take customers diving in any type of marine protected area, and the most common type of area which diving occurs are in the Ngoli Goli traditional fishing grounds. The Ngoli Goli are the customary traditional fishing grounds that are managed by the local villagers adjacent to them. In these areas, the traditional resource users have rights to access and harvest these areas for subsistence and to also clear tombus and seasonal closures. These are similar to the local marine managed areas that my colleague Kate mentioned early in her presentation. Moving on to the next level of marine protection, 7 of the dive operators responded that they dive in no-take marine reserves, and 4 people mentioned that they dive in a marine protected area that bans commercial fishing but allows for local subsistence. The remainder of dive operators were not sure what the status was of protection in the areas they were diving in. Despite the overall sense that coral reefs are healthy, both sample populations of these surveys and interviewed thought that marine protection in their area can be improved. This could indicate a desire to preserve current ecosystem conditions, or it could indicate a desire to see improvement in conditions in a given area. It may also likely indicate that the recreational dive community sees the value of protecting marine ecosystems as an effective policy. During the informal interviews with dive professionals, I asked the question, if you were put in charge, what would you do to protect coral reefs in Fiji if you were put in charge of a marine protection policy? And these were the types of responses I received in the informal interviews. I made a graph to kind of show that, but MPAs surfaced as the most frequently response in the context of either creating more MPAs, extending the boundaries of existing ones, declaring more tambu areas and seasonal closures, or establishing more no-take marine reserves. This was followed by a theme of increasing community awareness and education in the village, with an emphasis on more environmental awareness of not dropping anchors on the corals, using mooring lines, and proper disposal of trash. Size limits on fish and limits on catch were another common theme that surfaced during the informal interviews. So this next slide is the same question from the previous slide, but this was from the survey of dive operations. The results are very similar. with more marine protected areas being the most frequent response. Size limits and species restriction on take was the second most commonly response mentioned, followed by more education and awareness and management of land-based activities such as runoff and human pollution. Finally, I wanted to answer my question. Is there anyone in the recreational dive community using a citizen science-based approach to collect data through diver observations? Of the 25 dive professionals I interviewed, only 9 were aware of any type of citizen science data collection that dive operators in Fiji participate in. The only type of data mentioned was the Great Fiji Shark Count, which occurs every April and November. Of the 30 dive operators that responded to my survey, this is how they responded when asked the question, is there anyone in the recreational dive community using citizen science to collect data through diver observation? Once again, the Great Fiji Shark Count was the most commonly thing mentioned about data collection. However, a large majority of the respondents either had no idea who was participating in citizen science and data collection, or they were not sure. These are the results. Overall, the recreational dive community in Fiji perceives that coral reef ecosystems are relatively healthy, aside from previous cyclone impacts from which reefs are still recovering from. There is generally unanimous support for greater marine protection efforts, particularly focused on monitoring and enforcement of marine protected areas. Community-based awareness and education about the importance of marine ecosystems is viewed as essential for improving marine protection and policy. The desire for a government to do more to protect coral reefs is evident. There is a lack of capacity in Fiji for patrolling and monitoring MPAs throughout the Fiji Islands. People would need to be trained at the community level by government officials and given the authority to patrol and work as fish wardens. There would need to be support for small boats and fuel to monitor marine protected areas, and any breaches and regulations would need to be properly enforced with fines and penalties for violations. One way to do this would be to establish and designate more MPAs that could be funded through dive tourism and user fees, and the proceeds collected would have to be properly allocated and managed to include things such as installing moorings to keep boats from anchoring on the reef, and a portion of the funding would need to be put towards hosting workshops in Fijian communities. Citizen science data collection efforts within the recreational dive industry in Fiji are minimal at best. As of now, the only type of data that the recreational dive community participates in is the Great Fiji Shark Count that occurs every April and November. Other types of data collection efforts that use diver observations are not done by recreational dive operations, but instead various volunteer conservation organizations such as GVI Frontier and Projects Abroad. After 9 years, I once again find myself leaving behind a new set of footprints in the sand. But as another sun sets in the Fiji Islands, this time I leave with a deeper respect, appreciation, hope, and perception for at least the time beings, perhaps coral reefs in Fiji are in an overall healthy condition, despite the changes that have occurred. Increased fishing pressure, marine pollution, natural disturbances, and climate change are still serious threats that coral reefs will have to adapt to. But some of these are variables that we may have control over. Moving forward, the government of Fiji's Prime Minister has made it a commitment to include 30% of Fiji's exclusive economic zone into a marine protected area. Hopefully, if these types of capacity issues that have come up in the surveys and interviews can be communicated and addressed, both at the government and district level, then perhaps Fiji will be able to follow through with this commitment that it has made for 2020. I want to thank everybody on my Capstone committee, Stuart Sandin, Alfredo Horon, and Lindsay Bonito. I want to thank Samantha Murray for all her hard work she's done with the NBC program this year. I want to thank Clinton Edwards for helping me workshop an IRB survey a couple of days before I had to fly to Fiji. And thank you, cohort, for all your support this year. I enjoyed working with all of you. Vinaka Vakalevu. Does anybody have any questions?
That was a great job, Allison. Congrats on being able to pull off your plan B. That was really interesting. I'm curious, these results seem to me very interesting, and I'm sure they would also be useful to certain communities that you were traveling in. Mm-hmm. Do you have plans for the data and the results from this data once we're finished?
I have said to the Coral Reef Alliance Network that I will share the results after I've written a report, and also there's a dive college in Tabuni that was interested in my data because they're starting a new dive college in Tabuni and they're thinking about scholarship programs and stuff for the future. So I was hoping that somehow what I did could be useful for things like that.
Cool, thank you.
I had a quick question, hold on. So you mentioned when you were 23, you went to Fiji and you were diving there, and
Yes.
that you had a desire to go back to see the changes. And I know your project focused on diving, kind of how they thought about it and how dive managers thought about it, but I'm curious about what you thought about it. I know you got a chance to dive there. Did you see any big changes from the 9 years?
Well, diving wasn't a big part of my capstone due to the changes, but I believe in life, sometimes opportunities come your way and you have to take them. So it was supposed to be the last week of my trip, I got an opportunity. Somebody invited me that managed a liveaboard to go out and do some diving. They said, Allison, here's a chance. We invite you out. Why don't you come out and see some of these marine reserves? See what you think. So necessarily me as an outsider that hasn't been living in the Fiji Islands, I lived there for 2009 and 2010, that's been a while, so there's a lot of changes. So, some of the things that I observed, I'm observing them through my perspective of not being in the area for a long time and then coming back and saying, wow, these are really beautiful, so I haven't been diving or seeing changes, but I can say that they were quite beautiful, and I didn't see a lot of bleaching or coral disease. I felt, from my perception, they looked like a beautiful, healthy ecosystem, but I haven't been there to see all the changes. And then climate change happens on a much longer scale, so those are things you're not going to be observing. But I did see hurricane damage from Winston and Now Island, but I saw a lot of beautiful, healthy, vibrant coral reefs in Vatuira Passage, in Namina Marine Reserve, in a lot of the areas that I dove. So I thought it was a wonderful experience.